midst of a growing relationship between my organization, the Drug Policy Alliance, and Students for Liberty. I think some of you may know, DPA, Drug Policy Alliance, we are the basically leading organization in the U.S. and to some extent around the world advocating for alternatives to the war on drugs. That's what we're about. And I have to assume that if there's a coincidence of interest between what we do and what Students for Liberty does, this has got to be one of the greatest coincidences of interest that has ever emerged. And so what I want to talk about is how to think about this, what we do, and how to make the most of this. How to make the most of this. You know, and let me just start off by saying the reason that I'm involved in this is because I hate the war on drugs. I really, really hate the war on drugs. I hate it because it's stupid, because it's cruel, because it's ineffective, because it's costly, because it's non-compassionate. I hate it because it generates organized crime and violence and corruption. I hate it because it makes drugs more dangerous, it makes more people likely to die. I hate it because it's infused with racial injustice, both in our country and around the world. I hate it because of what it is doing, not just in the U.S., but all throughout the Americas, in Central America, the Caribbean, Latin America, and in West Africa, and in Afghanistan, and almost around the world, in terms of generating crime, corruption, violence, and all of that. I hate it because of the damn hypocrisy it generates. I hate it because looking at politicians turn into whimpering, dishonest, disingenuous fools when they talk about this drug issue because of their fears of moving forward. And most of all, I hate it because it is the greatest threat I can think of in our country to our fundamental freedom and liberty. That's, I think, what we have to understand. For me, this issue, I regard myself first and foremost as a human rights activist. That's what I am. And that's what Drug Policy Alliance is a human rights organization. We regard this and the violations committed in the name of the war on drugs as human rights issues. What is liberty about, but about human rights? Isn't that what it's about deep down, fighting against oppression and against the oppression of the state, against people who find ways to co-opt the state's power on behalf of their own interests, and state authorities that have no constraints, and who can play on public fears and prejudices to do great harms to huge numbers of people within their society? I mean, that's what it is we're fighting about, right? So, you know, I've been involved in this for a long time, and we're at a moment right now where things are really happening. I mean, you can see what's going on with marijuana. It's amazing. The change in public opinion around what to do with marijuana is astounding. You line up the Gallup polls on gay marriage and marijuana legalization, they line up almost identically over the last 7 or 8 years. Nobody 10 years ago could have predicted that at this point in 2014 in America, we would have this level of support, a significant majority, and not just in the western states, but even public opinion polls in Texas and Florida and Indiana and even Mississippi, or Louisiana, saying that you have more people in favor of legalizing marijuana than opposed, right? What Colorado and Washington did, and those votes, I mean, those weren't squeaker votes, right? In Colorado, the vote to legalize marijuana got more votes than President Obama got in his re-election campaign, and he got a lot of votes. And in Washington State, it got almost as many votes as Obama, and more than either of the guys who won the race for governor and attorney general. So these were not squeaker votes, these were transformative. They were transformative votes, right? Hopefully this year we're going to see Oregon go forward, hopefully Alaska be the next state. I don't think we'll be able to pull off California. We got a few days to figure this out still. I don't think so, but it is moving forward. And not just in our country, but outside, in Uruguay as well, which became the first country just 2 months ago to decide to legalize marijuana and to do it through the legislative process. So there's this amazing momentum moving forward. My role, and Drug Policy Alliance's role in all of this thing, is just keep the ball moving down the field. More states, more countries, more relaxation by the federal government. And I'll tell you this, I mean, probably nobody was more critical of the Obama administration the first term than we were because of his hypocrisy and obfuscating the drug policy issue. But I have to hand it to those guys. Because on the issues of marijuana reform, and I'll also talk about sentencing reform in a minute, those guys are actually stepping out in quite a remarkable way. What they've done by saying to Colorado and Washington, here's a qualified green light to move forward, notwithstanding the fact that what you're doing is illegal under federal law. What they did a few days ago and to say, we're going to figure out ways to allow the marijuana industry to use legal banking, right? When Barack Obama gave the interview in New Yorker magazine and he talked about marijuana in the most honest way that any president ever has, and basically acknowledged that it's no more dangerous, maybe less dangerous than alcohol, and when he described the votes in Oregon and Washington as important, and when the President of the United States gets out on a hot-button social issue like that and does it before any one of the 100 members of the U.S. Senate has actually said the same thing, or before almost any governor of the United States has said it, so I know that in this liberty-minded seeking audience, Barack Obama is not the most popular guy, but I gotta say, on this issue and on these issues, I've been taken aback at how fast they're making good on some of these commitments. There's a level, I wouldn't call it bold, but it ain't timid either. There's some movement there. But the key is keeping this ball moving down the field, right? Moving down the field. That means watching out, that we don't screw up on this thing, right? One of the things that's going on, you know, most movements for personal freedom and justice, think about the movements for gay rights, civil rights, women's rights. There were powerful economic components to these things. Right? Transforming and ending the discrimination against people based upon the color of their skin or their gender or their sexual preference. Right? That had significant economic implications. But what's unique about marijuana reform is that we are simultaneously fighting to stop the 750,000 arrests each year of people with simple marijuana possession, to stop the organized crime and violence associated with that stuff, to stop the racial disproportionality whereby young black men who are no more likely to have a joint in their pocket than young white men are 3, 5, 10 times more likely than them to be arrested. We're fighting for this because of reasons involving justice and fairness and liberty. But the other piece of this is this market dimension. Because in increasing freedom in this area, we are simultaneously opening up or transforming what was an illegal market into a legal market. It means that our allies are people who actually don't particularly necessarily have any interest in these broader political causes. They're just trying to make a buck. Nothing wrong with that. So long as the urge to make a buck doesn't turn into stupid forms of greed that lands up pushing this whole thing backward. Right? It's important for people who are libertarian-minded and don't like taxes to understand that when you're trying to take marijuana out of the prohibition system and put it into the legal system, that's the only way to win over the public in the middle. That's very wary, very cautious, certainly not pro-marijuana, is to say we're going to regulate and tax this stuff instead of prohibiting it. That is far and away a lesser evil than the human and economic tax imposed by marijuana prohibition. It means understanding that while we may want everybody to be free to grow and sell what they want, that in the absence of regulation, what I fear is what happened in Montana with medical marijuana, whereby the state voted 10 years ago to legalize medical marijuana, but the state government failed to regulate it anyway, and people started to take advantage, and the next thing you know, the public, which had supported this move, flipped around the other way. And the next thing you know, the legislature and the U.S. attorneys and everybody were basically shutting almost everything down there. We can't take that risk. It means understanding that the process to move towards a non-prohibitionist system with respect to marijuana and other drugs requires pragmatism, requires compromise, and requires being careful. It's not going to be good for us. It's not going to be good for us if all of a sudden we see a major jump in daily use in marijuana by teenagers. Last thing we need is a doubling in the number of kids waking and baking every morning and freaking out their parents and their school teachers and everything like that. We don't need that. I'll tell all of you, for any of you who like marijuana, as I do and have for a very long time, be responsible. Be responsible in your use of it. You know, this whole thing now with edibles getting very popular, You know, every day now, there's some article about some kid who ate his mom's brownie. Oh, shit. You know, next thing they know, they're in the doctor's office, and the kid's, eyes are spinning around. He's not going to kill him, but it's scary as all hell. Every veterinarian in America has got one story after another of the dogs and cats and God knows what else showing up high as a kite, right? I mean, it's not nice to dogs and cats to do that, but it means being smart and being careful, right? It means being, just as it does with alcohol, it means being smart and being careful about this. So I got to tell you, simply taking marijuana out of the criminal justice system is going to be a huge step forward in advancing freedom in our country. If we can start sealing people's records so that the tens of millions of people of a marijuana possession conviction are no longer treated as criminals and no longer discriminated, that will be a major advance. If we can turn this entirely from an illegal industry to a legal one, that will be a major advance. But our struggle is not just about marijuana. Marijuana's got a lot of steam now. Marijuana legalization, we can get from here to there if we are smart and careful. Do not assume that our opponents are just going to lie down and let us roll over them. Do not assume that they will no longer fund opposition. Being smart and careful. But there's a broader drug war out there. And whereas marijuana may account for half the drug arrests in America, it does not account for half the people locked up on a drug charge in America. It does not explain most of the violence and organized crime and corruption happening in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa, and Afghanistan, and everywhere else. It does not do that. Ultimately, we need solutions to that as well. It means that when we think about marijuana exceptionalism, marijuana is exceptional. I don't just mean in terms of those of us who like it and find it exceptional, right? What I mean is marijuana is exceptional because among all the illegal drugs, it's the one which we know. It's the one which many of us have used, and at this point in history, many of our parents have used. Right? It's the one which nobody's ever died of an overdose from. It's the one which, although it can be addictive, does not compare in addictive harm to the other drugs. Right? It's the one which has remarkable medicinal properties. Right? Marijuana is exceptional, and we should make the most of marijuana's exceptionalism to end marijuana prohibition as rapidly as we can. But at the same time, we have to be careful that in making the most of marijuana exceptionalism, we do not simultaneously undermine our efforts to end the war of drugs with respect to the other drugs as well. Yes! Some of those drugs can be more dangerous. You can die of an overdose involving heroin or a pharmaceutical opiate. You can take too much cocaine and damage your heart. You can do too much methamphetamine and it does all sorts of not very pleasant things, right? But when people say, let's legalize marijuana so we can crack down on the other drugs and drug users and drug sellers, you know what I say to them? Shut the hell up. We don't need that kind of stuff. I mean, if you want to say so I can crack down on violent murderers and rapists, okay, I can go with that. If you want to say, which is what the public likes to hear, that by legalizing marijuana, it'll free up police resources to go after more serious crime, including all sorts of predatory crimes and white-collar crimes and violent crimes and domestic abuse and all that stuff, fine, okay? But don't say and don't try to demonize the other drugs just because they are more challenging. Because ultimately we need a different policy with respect to them as well. Now some people will say, well, let's just legalize all of them as well. Many of you here would say that. And on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I say that too. But I don't always say it on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. And I'm ambivalent on Sundays. And I'll tell you why. Well, first of all, of course, the chance that we're actually going to, as a country, this country and another country, actually legalize heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine like alcohol and cigarettes is very, very low any time in the foreseeable future. Even as we've seen support for legalizing marijuana go from the low 20% in the 80s to 55% today, we've seen support for legalizing all drugs basically hover in the 10 to 15% area, maybe 20%, I asked the question, for decades. The Dutch, who more or less legalized marijuana 30, 35 years ago, there's been no increase in support for legalizing the other drugs, right? So what we're not seeing, first of all, is the traction on the public even being willing to engage this debate, right? Secondly, there is a question about whether or not that would be the optimal policy. To the extent we do care about not seeing a massive increase in drug addiction in our country, we simply don't know. We simply don't know what would happen. And you know what else? It's the nature of change in this country and virtually every other. That even when it happens quickly as it is with marijuana today, it still happens incrementally. Decriminalization, then we legalize medical marijuana, then one state, then two states, et cetera, et cetera. Incremental change is the name of the game. And for those people, those of us, and I hope we're all in this camp, who believe in advancing freedom in our country, being willing to make the commitment to engage on the incremental reforms that get us toward that ultimate vision, being willing to learn what needs to be done and showing the same passion for those incremental reforms as one does for the broader vision is going to be the key to success. Because part of it is that when one engages in incremental work and when one engages in all of the political deal-making and compromises and alliances in doing incremental work in state legislatures and Congress and all of that, with all sorts of allies who may come at it for different reasons, somebody needs to be keeping their eye on the ball and asking the question, does this incremental reform or that incremental reform, does it take us 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, or 2 steps forward and 3 steps back? I look at some of my allies who got all excited about drug courts. Ain't drug courts great? Got a compassionate judge, and instead of sending somebody to jail or prison, we're going to send them to treatment and give them a chance to get clean there. And if they can't quite get clean, we'll keep punishing them until they get it. But then when you look at the evidence, what you realize is some drug courts are 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, but other drug courts simply take people who would have had the charges dismissed and shove them into the criminal justice system. Some drug courts keep drug testing people forever and ever and ever, and if they never can or will stop, they just keep locking them up forever and ever and ever. Some drug courts are driven by judges who don't know anything about drug treatment and project their own views out there. Others, they land up embracing a system which ends up widening the net of criminal justice and oppression in our society. I, a Drug Policy Alliance, and my allies, we need a growing movement for this, and it needs more and more people who have their eye on the long-term vision of advancing freedom to the maximum extent possible. Now, here's the way I think about drug policy. I start off with the assumption that drugs are here to stay. That there has never been a drug-free society, except maybe the Eskimos because they couldn't grow anything, but by and large, there's never been a drug-free society, there's never gonna be a drug-free society, right? Drugs are here to stay. And that the real challenge is not to figure out how do we build a higher wall or a bigger moat between those drugs and ourselves, those drugs and our kids, or you guys, or the kids you will one day have. That's not the challenge. We've been doing that for 40, 50, 80, 100 years at a cost of over $1 trillion to the taxpayers and trillions of dollars around the world, and it has not worked and it's made things worse. The challenge is, how do we accept the fact that drugs are here to stay? That they are a reality. And then a generation from now and 2 generations from now, there will be even more psychoactive drugs than we have today, being produced legally and perhaps still illegally down the road. That's the nature, that these will be new plants and new chemicals and new designer this and designer that we will have, ecstasy generation 5 and Ritalin generation 8 and Viagra generation 12 and all sorts of combo drugs and you name it. That is, whether we like it or not, that is the world into which we are heading. And that therefore the challenge for us as a society is how do we take a deep breath, accept that simple fact that drugs are here to stay, and learn how to live with them so they cause the least possible harm, and in some cases the greatest possible benefit. That's the challenge. It is what one might call the adult perspective on this if only the adults were acting the way adults were supposed to act in this issue area. As somebody who grew up Jewish, the other way I would say it is what's called the Menschkeit approach to dealing with drugs. For those of you who don't know, Mensch is a Yiddish word. It basically means a human being who tries to apply both his brain and his heart in dealing with the tough struggles of life to do the right thing. It's that Menschkeit approach to dealing with it, the decent approach. Now, intellectually, here's the way I think about it. Imagine all drug policy options as arrayed along the spectrum. From at one end, the most draconian, primitive, punitive, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, cut off your head, pull out your fingernails, whip them for this, pull them off the streets with no cause whatsoever, drug testing and throw them into quote-unquote re-education drug camps, whatever, that. And then bing, 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 down to the US, down to Europe, the other end over here, where you have essentially the free market approach, right? The one that says no prohibitions, no controls, except perhaps to restrict access to young people, right? That's spectrum. Now, what the objective, if I'm asked to define what is DPA, Drug Policy Alliance's objective, what is the objective of the growing drug policy reform movement in one sentence? It's a long sentence, but one sentence. Our objective is to reduce the role of criminalization and the criminal justice system in drug control to the maximum extent consistent with protecting safety and health. Say it again. To reduce the role of criminalization and the criminal justice system in drug control to the maximum extent consistent with protecting safety and health. It is that. We have no choice, first of all, but to move in an incremental direction. We have no choice but to do that, right? But it means that we need to move from here to rolling back to mandatory minimum sentences, which we now see Democrats and Republicans, and not just Ron Rand Paul, but also even Ted Cruz and Mike Lee supporting these movements with the Democrats for this stuff. It means no longer putting people behind bars for simple drug possession, looking what the Portuguese are doing this and looking at the model of that. It means treating addiction as a health issue and not restricting access to sterile syringes to reduce the spread of HIV or AIDS. It means that when there is an antidote for a heroin or other opiate overdose, it's called naloxone, and naloxone is a miracle drug. Somebody you know overdoses. Every household in America, and certainly any household, that somebody who is using opiate drugs, either legally or illegally, for pain or for pleasure, should have this antidote in their house. It means making that thing available over the counter as easy as possible so people know how to use it. It means, of course, it means taking marijuana entirely out of the criminal justice system because the benefits are so extraordinary and the risks of that so minimal. It means looking what the Europeans, beginning with the Swiss, and then the Dutch, and the Germans, and the Danes, and the English, and to some extent the Canadians, have done in saying to people who are addicted to street heroin, that if you cannot quit, and you've tried methadone, and you've tried buprenorphine, and you've tried drug-free programs, and you've tried NA and AA and all that sort of stuff, then you know what? You can come to this clinic, and you can take as much pharmaceutical-grade heroin as you want. Can't take it all, they'll say, but you can get it here, with the help that you may need to stabilize your life. And I'll explain why that makes sense shortly. It needs all of those policies. And you know what we know with all of these incremental policies? We know that all of these incremental policies, from needle exchange programs and legal access to needles to heroin maintenance and methadone maintenance and ending marijuana prohibition, that all of these things and ending the criminalization of drug possession so that nobody goes to jail simply for possessing or using a drug in the absence of doing harm to some other human being. We know that every one of those incremental steps, from an empirical scientific perspective, presents minimal, if any, risk to the broader public health and safety while presenting substantial benefits. It means we need to do that work in the city councils and the state legislatures, in the schools, and ultimately the federal government, international institutions, to move down this spectrum, but always keeping our eye on that vision down there. That vision down there. That's how we avoid the missteps. Right? Now, does that mean that we don't talk about broader legalization the bold legalization, the full-scale legalization, we have to keep talking about it. We have to keep putting it out there. And you know why? Even if it's not going to happen, we have to keep putting it out there for two essential reasons. The first one is that when you talk about legalization, what it does is it highlights intellectually, cognitively for people the distinction between the harms that result from drugs per se and the harms that result from the prohibitionist laws and policies. It helps you understand that, yes, there are harms with drugs. It may be cirrhosis of the liver with alcohol and cancer with this. It may be overdose potential with pharmaceutical drugs. It may be that there are explicit harms involving just pure drugs legally produced. But that when you look at the gangsters in Mexico and Central America and our own country and around the world profiting from this $300 billion a year illegal industry, that's a UN estimate, that's not about drugs. That's about prohibition. When you look at the massive levels of corruption and low-paid officials, from police officials to government officials, being offered the choice of either the blood or the bullet, that's about failed drug prohibition. When you look at the story of alcohol prohibition in America with Al Capone in Chicago, magnified 50 or 100-fold into places like Mexico and Central America and other parts of the world, that's about drug prohibition. When you look at drugs made more dangerous and more adulterated and cut with all sorts of crap, that's about drug prohibition. When you look at the violations of civil liberties and civil rights, when you look at massively overflowing jails and prisons, that's not about drugs. That's about drug prohibition. When you look at the evisceration of fundamental constitutional safeguards in the Bill of Rights, that's about the failure of drug prohibition. So talking about legalization, and when I see President Arnold Perez Molina in Guatemala or Santos in Colombia boldly putting that on the table once in a while, or the former presidents from some of these countries who are involved with the Global Commission on Drug Policy, what they are trying to do there is to provoke that discussion. Because for decades, the drug warriors, so to speak, have been committed to conflating it. They want people to confuse the harms of drugs and the harms of drug prohibition. They're the ones commissioning those bullshit economic studies that look at the cost of drugs in America, and they just put everything in the kitchen sink in there, from the cost of addiction to a drug per se, to all the harms of prohibition and incarceration. So that's the first reason, so that people make that distinction between the harms of drugs and the harms of prohibition. But you know the second reason? The second reason to talk about legalization is it gets not just us but others to ask this fundamental question: what is it that we're so scared of? Why are we actually scared of the notion, I'm not saying we in this room, but we as a society, of the notion of all drugs being legally available? What's that about? I mean, I'll tell you, deep down, I think what it's about is basically a fundamental view of human nature in the context of modern society. And some of us simply believe that, in fact, even if drugs are widely available, we're just not going to have any significant increase in drug addiction. And others believe that if you do open up the floodgates in that way, that we will become like Sodom and Gomorrah, you know, with a massive increases in drug addiction and misery and disease and all these sorts of things. And there is no way to empirically prove it one way or the other. Now, on behalf of those who have faith, I can say, look at the late 19th century America. Right? When heroin, opium, other things, cocaine, you know, Coca-Cola had cocaine until 1900 in it, and there was no massive Coca-Cola addiction problem as far as we know, right? You had a higher percentage of the American population using and maybe even being dependent upon opiates back then, right? But I mean, no major problem, no major drug crime problem, right? But there's all sorts of reasons to say, you know what? Almost anybody who would become a drug addict if drugs were legal is already a drug addict now, or would become so even if it became illegal. And then, in fact, the illegality of drug addiction just makes it that much more destructive and damaging both to them and their families and their communities. Well, what gives me pause? What gives me pause are two things. One is what happened with cigarettes. You know, people used tobacco, pipes, all this, cigars, late 19th century, rolled in. And then the early part of the 20th century, they invented the cigarette rolling machine. And all of a a sudden it started to take off. It became part of what the rations for the troops in World War I. And we came back and we put cigarettes into our country in a way before most people really realized what that was going to be about. And it turned out to be this remarkably difficult drug to stop using. In every survey of heroin addicts where they ask heroin addicts what's the toughest drug to quit, you know what they always say? Cigarettes, right? So one of my fears, and mind you, look at the harm. People, oh God, I love people. My own father died probably prematurely because of that, and people, it is such a torture. And my fear, first of all, and it's what keeps me from going all the way like that, is to say, I don't want to see another one of those things emerge. Something else that's sneaky and a bit insidious, and before you know it, 30 or 40% of the country loves it, is doing it, is committed to it, and only years later do you realize that this stuff is hard to stop, and it's actually killing a lot of people. And the other thing that gives me pause, and I'm actually curious if this issue's been discussed in the circles here, is what's happened with food in the last few decades, right? I mean, here we have major corporations that are increasingly sophisticated and producing these products that come up with wonderful mixtures of the three most powerful drugs known to humankind, which are sugar, fat, salt, sugar, fat, salt, sugar, fat, salt. Doing all the brain chemistry and all this sort of stuff, and all the fast foods and all those sorts of things, and coming up with those things. I remember when Krispy Kreme donuts came out. It was like, what happened to my brain? I'd walk past and the fumes would come out, my brain would be like somebody had just injected something there. I mean, that was way out ahead. It was like something that had imported from the 22nd century to fuck with my head. I mean, excuse my but I worry, and then you look at the way obesity has grown in this country remarkably, not just because of the food manufacturers, a lot of other reasons going on, but what's gone is it happened so quickly, right? Commercial forces, profit-seeking, creation, people's taste, consumers, all of that shot out way ahead, and now, of course, we're dealing with something of a public health disaster that's costing this country a vast amount of money, whether we like it or not, that we're going to have to find a way to deal with, in addition to all the problems resulting in people's happiness in their own lives. So if I pause before embracing the full libertarian vision on this stuff, it's really to some extent for those reasons. But it's not a reason. The fact of the matter is we have to keep asking ourselves, what is it that we're so afraid of, and what is the best way to mitigate those fears ever being actualized, while at the same time maximizing freedom and liberty in the way we approach this problem. For DPA, we got three major objectives. First, end the criminalization of marijuana. You know what I'm fighting for? So that a generation from now, and hopefully sooner, your children will look back on the marijuana wars and marijuana prohibition of the 20th and early 21st century, the same way that today we look back on alcohol prohibition and go, what the hell was that all about? And that's all about. The second thing that we're fighting for is ending the criminalization of drug possession. I mean, I fundamentally believe that there is no basis in science, in medicine, in ethics, or for that matter, in the Bible, in discriminating between people who put drug X, Y, or Z in their body and people who put another drug in their body. There is no basis for saying that if you use alcohol, tobacco, or some pharmaceuticals, or whatever, that's okay and you're not a criminal unless you get behind the wheel of a car when you're high. But if you even touch that drug, hold that drug, put that drug in your body, you are a criminal who becomes subject to the coercive powers of the state, right? I mean, there is no legitimate basis in science, medicine, ethics, or the Bible for making that distinction. There is no legitimate basis because not just between the drugs, but between the casual, responsible, recreational user of alcohol or tobacco and the one who uses heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, marijuana, psychedelics in the same way. And similarly, there is no legitimate basis in science, medicine, ethics, or the Bible for saying that you who are addicted to alcohol and you who are addicted to cigarettes get to deal with it that way, and you who are addicted to this, that, or this, you get dealt with it through the criminal justice system. No legitimate basis whatsoever. Nor, for that matter, is there any basis that says, if you got a lot of money and your skin is that much whiter, You get to deal with this addiction in 9 times out of 10 privately without the state being involved. But if you happen to be poor and your skin is darker, sorry, Jack, we only provide help over there in the prison system or through that system. That cannot be right. That cannot be right. Now, I said our major objective, right, is about moving things down the spectrum. Moving the policies down the spectrum, right? Not just marijuana reform, but now it's about passing 911 Good Samaritan laws so that if you witness somebody overdosing, whether it's from a legitimate pharmaceutical, painkiller, or whether it's heroin, that you can call 911 right away. Call 911 right away and have the police show up and not be there to arrest you, but rather to administer naloxone to try to save a life rather than to incarcerate a life. Right? That is one of the passions of my organization, is passing this legislation around the country, and I'm glad that finally the Obama Drug Czar's office has embraced this policy approach. It means making sure that this miracle antidote, naloxone, or otherwise known as Narcan, is available everywhere and over the counter. It means making sure that just simple education, that most people who die of an overdose, first of all, you don't die of an overdose right away. It usually takes an hour and a half before you actually die. That's the moment. But friends who freak out and leave their friend and throw them into a bathtub with ice cold water or drive into the emergency room and run away, that's when people die. But it's also knowing that most people who die of an overdose don't die because they took too much heroin. And that could happen. Or because maybe the heroin was cut with fentanyl or some other thing. Most overdose fatalities actually involve combining these drugs with alcohol, or sometimes with Valium-type drugs. You gotta know that. If you're just simply taking a pain medication prescribed by your doctor, or if you're screwing around with these drugs to get high, it may be that a beer will make you feel that much more good, but the risk level escalates dramatically. And most what are called heroin or opiate overdose fatalities could just as easily be called alcohol overdoses, where they have in the mix of the opiates. It's knowing that kind of information, right? But in changing the laws and policies, the other thing that's needed, and I think it's sometimes where we may be our own worst enemies, even as we change attitudes regarding prohibitionist laws, we also need to educate and change attitudes regarding the reality of these drugs. It is not acceptable to buy into the myth that heroin kills just like that, or cocaine or methamphetamine or demon drugs, which anybody does, and that they're addicted to right away. And then just say, well, we don't care if people get addicted, to hell with them, that's not my problem, it's not the state's problem, and blah, 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 blah. And to have a callous view that says, we don't care about people who are harmed by their own vulnerabilities or addictions or whatever. What is much more effective is educating oneself about the realities of these drugs and knowing the science about these things. Let me talk to you about heroin. This has been in the news a lot, especially since Philip Seymour Hoffman, died tragically by taking a heroin overdose in one way or another. What else he was taking, we don't know. If you go to a doctor, and by the way, none of this is a recommendation to take heroin. Let me say, don't take heroin, but there's some things you gotta know. If you go to a doctor, you say, Doc, I'm thinking of taking heroin. What will it do to me? And he goes, well, where are you going to get it from? You get it from the street. It could be cut with all sorts of things, impurities, where you get the needles. I mean, no, Doc. I got access to pure heroin, the kind they produce in those pharmaceutical companies in Europe, where they do produce pure heroin. And I know exactly how many milligrams I'm going to be getting when I take it. So, Doc, what happens if I start taking it? He goes, well, I mean, if you take it every day, at some point it's going to be hard to stop. I mean, it's going to be like, it won't be quite as hard as quitting cigarettes, but when you do stop, it will be like either having something like a flu or really like feeling like death warmed over. And there's some possibility, we're not sure, that you may reduce your body's capacity to produce endorphins, your own natural opiates in your body, for a long time of life, which may require taking methadone or some other medication the rest of your life. So just be aware of that. And he says, okay, Doc, I got that. So,
Alcohol, if I drink it every day in big doses, it's going to destroy my liver, right? Yeah. Cocaine, I take too much of that could hurt my heart. Yeah, right. Cigarettes, smoke cigarettes, oh yeah, lung cancer, all sorts of other things. Doc, what if I'm just taking pure heroin every day? What's it going to do to me? You know what the doctor's going to say? What's the principal negative effects going to be? You know what the doctor's going to say? Somebody just said it. Constipation. Constipation. Opiates stop you up. That's why they've been very popular throughout history, especially when there's bad sanitation, diarrhea, all this sort of stuff, right? Opiates cause constipation. All sorts of opiates cause constipation. Not fun, not pleasant. You know what else will happen? It'll reduce your sensitivity, perhaps, to physical and emotional pain, right? But the doctor will say, if you actually have legal, pure heroin, and you know the dose, and you're not jacking it up and down all the time, well, you can actually take it every day in your life and live to be 95, if that's what you're genetically determined to be, because it's not going to destroy your bodily organs, right? I don't know how many of you knew that, but it's important for you to know. And it's why 20-odd years ago in Switzerland, in Zurich, and other cities, when they were looking at heroin addicts, you know, Switzerland's the best market in the world for illegal drugs because their currency is so strong that if you're a drug dealer, you want to sell drugs, get the biggest profit return, go to Switzerland. Very inflated currency, right? So you have a lot of growing number of heroin addicts, right, all on the streets, causing crime, all sorts of things. First the Dutch said, let's, try shellacking them up, let's try this, let's set up a park behind the train station where they all know do. That didn't work out so well. Then they finally said, let's allow them. They tried methadone maintenance, right, which is like a nicotine patch, is to cigarettes, right? They finally just said, okay, if you've hit that point in life where you're tired of living a life on the street as a street junkie, but you cannot imagine living without your lady love heroin. You can't imagine living that way. Well, you know what? And everything you've tried hasn't worked. Come on in. Come on into this clinic. Come up to 3 times a day. Take as much as you want. Can't take it home. We're going to provide other helping services, et cetera. And that's what we're going to do. Well, they set these programs up, and they started studying, first in Switzerland, the Netherlands, Germany. You know what they found? People started coming to these programs, and you know what happened? They stopped using illegal heroin, no surprise. They also reduced the use of other illegal drugs. You know what else? They started having many fewer overdoses. They stopped being less at risk for HIV and hepatitis C. Their arrest records dropped substantially, right? Their involvement in criminality dropped. Some of them started to get part-time jobs. They began to stabilize their lives. They began to reconnect with their families, right? Really interesting results. They did a cost-benefit assessment, and they found that the cost of these programs was more than paid for by the savings in criminal justice and healthcare costs for taking care of heroin addiction, right? Then they started to educate the public about this scientific experiments, and the public started to embrace it, and you saw first the cities in the country of Switzerland make it all legal, and then Germany did the same thing, and Netherlands did the same thing. And you know what else happened? They tried saying that when the heroin first came in, and they realized they get as much as they wanted, first they wanted more and more and more. And then they wanted less and less and less because they realized they weren't getting the buzz that they used to like getting before. Right? And then what happened? Then another 20% of them or whatever decided, let me try to make that methadone maintenance work. I can take that home and just take it once a day. And they made something work, an easier form of medical treatment. And then what happened? Another 20% or so decided to get off heroin for good and do it and make it work. Now, why did that work? Their life's dream had just come true. Come to the clinic, and here's all the heroin you can want, up to 3 times a day. And it's legal. And it was either free or $10 a day, because it didn't actually cost that much to make. Oh my God, life stream. And you know what happened when their life stream came true? All of a sudden they looked at that white powder and they said, that's my dream. That's what I'm spending every day chasing all the time to put that. Why am I doing that? And it's interesting. The American approach to date, the drug court coercive model, has been, if you're a drug addict, we don't want to lock you up at first, right? We're going to give you a chance to get clean. But they'll say, you hear this all the time, no addict quits using drugs on their own.
It's only with coercion. You got to beat them and pound them and force them and threaten them with jail if you want them to get clean. Right? That's the American drug court approach over all this sort of stuff. Drug test them, you know, oh, they can't. I mean, it's a little crazy because for those people who say drug addiction is disease, and then one of the symptoms of the disease is relapse, we're going to have one disease where the treatment for manifesting the symptoms of the disease is incarceration? And just play that one out again. It was a complicated concept, but it's like a strange concept. But you know, there's a different way of thinking about this. It emerged in the United States in the context of needle exchange programs. You know, people who are injecting drugs every day, going to needle exchange programs because they wanted to reduce their incidence of HIV, getting dirty needles, getting clean needles, getting some help, all this sort of stuff, right? And I know a friend of mine was once running a kind of social support group for one of these needle exchange programs. And the first day, all the drug users, we don't use the word junkies, but the junkies, right, were there. And they're talking, and everybody's talking about like scoring, getting, this, that, or, you know, all the kind of stuff, the hustle. And I have another session, and then they get to the point, and all of a sudden they start talking spontaneously, not being pushed, about stopping using. Stopping using. Why are they doing this? And then they start to ask questions about where they can get some help and some treatment. And you think, well, what would this be? For the first time in their life, they're in a place where they're not being judged for being a junkie, and they can just talk about it. And instead, the opposite thing is what's happening. Instead of being pushed and shoved in their face to stop, they're being accepted and not judged or demonized simply because of what they're putting in their body. And it's in that context that they begin to wonder about a different way of living and relating to these drugs in their midst. Right? It's why one of the first needle exchange programs in Tacoma, Washington, ultimately became the first point of the number one place referring people into drug treatment. The place that was not forcing anybody anywhere became the number one point of referral. You know why? Because it's where the whole harm reduction movement, the drug policy harm reduction movement, and the whole 12 steps movement and recovery movement intersect. It's because you understand that if you use drugs but you don't want to fall into addiction, or if you've fallen into addiction but you want to get out, you know what the number one thing you need to avoid falling into addiction and get out of it? You know what it is? A sense of dignity. A sense of dignity and self-worth. A system whereby a judge says, I'll give you a choice. Get clean right now or go to jail. That's not based upon dignity. That's based upon intimidation and coercion. A system that says, what are you doing here? You decide. You choose. You are the master of your own fate in life. That is the one that demonstrates better results in people getting healthy and getting clean, quote-unquote clean. Right? So understanding that, for each of you, to the extent you want to be advocate, that you want to advocate for ending drug prohibition in America, it means learning and embracing this reality. It means understanding, when we talk about methamphetamine, that methamphetamine is barely any different. That's a Ritalin that many of you, and Adderall that many of you took growing up and may still be taking today. Right? And then if you're taking methamphetamine in oral form, not that different from the Ritalin Adderall. Or conversely, if you're injecting Ritalin or Adderall, not that different than the methamphetamine that people are really down and out are injecting today. It means understanding with cocaine, you know, that it depends upon the dose. The dose is the poison. And then if you're taking it in the Coca Tea versions and Bolivia and these other lower form versions, it's not going to be any more addictive than a cup of coffee. And then maybe the answer to dealing with that whole cocaine thing in part is about allowing the lower potency forms of cocaine to be marketed internationally, just as they were in the late 19th century. It means let those Bolivian and Peruvian farmers produce their coca-based products for international export. If people want to buy that stuff and cook it up at home, okay, that's a separate issue, and maybe you allow that too. And maybe you don't allow it to be marketed in the crack forms or whatever, but you allow it to be sold in the less dangerous forms. You allow it to compete in international markets. But you need to know the facts and the history about cocaine, and amphetamine, and heroin to know. You need to know the same thing about psychedelics and why they could be a miracle drug, psychedelics. Right? The evidence emerging about dealing with PTSD and trauma and approaching death and a whole range of other things, the evidence and science is out there.
So it's not simply buying into some libertarians will, which is saying, these drugs kill, but the hell with the people who use them, not our business. It's understanding that sometimes the reason these drugs kill is because of the failed prohibitionist policy and because of the idiocy of our government and how they deal with these drugs in our society. You need to know this stuff. You need to learn this stuff. You need to read the books. You need to go to the website, Drug Policy Center, go to our table in the back.